In 1979, China invaded Vietnam, an event that caught the world by surprise. But why did a communist country like China launch an attack on another communist neighbor? The answer lies in a series of complex events that began in 1978. After the Vietnam War ended in 1975, Vietnam emerged victorious, having successfully resisted the United States for nearly 2 decades. This victory wasn't just a military win, it was a symbolic one, marking Vietnam's rise as a determined and resilient nation. But just a few years later, Vietnam took another bold step that would reshape the region. In 1978, Vietnam decided to invade Cambodia, not for territorial expansion, but to overthrow the Khmer Rouge regime, which was responsible for one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. Led by Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge had slaughtered an estimated 2 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population in just a few years. The world watched in horror, but for the most part, it did little to intervene. The United States and other Western powers were still recovering from their defeat in Vietnam and were hesitant to act in Cambodia. But Vietnam, despite its own scars from war, didn't hesitate. They saw the suffering of the Cambodian people up close and decided they couldn't wait for the international community to act. In December 1978, Vietnam launched a military campaign, swiftly defeating the Khmer Rouge and installing a new government. For Vietnam, this was more than just a military action. It was an attempt to stop the genocide and bring stability to a neighboring country. Vietnam's boldness, however, set off a chain reaction that would eventually lead to a confrontation with China. While the world stayed largely silent, Vietnam's intervention was seen as a threat by China, its long-standing regional rival, and that would soon lead to war. Despite the Khmer Rouge's cruelty, it was one of China's few allies in Southeast Asia. In the complex world of geopolitics, alliances were often formed for strategic reasons, not ideals. Cambodia, under Pol Pot, may have been brutal, but it shared China's communist ideology, making it a valuable partner, especially during the Cold War. In those days, China's influence in the region was challenged by the US, the Soviet Union, and their respective allies. Cambodia, as China's ally, helped keep Western influence in check. But when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, China's world was upended. The Khmer Rouge was no longer in power, and Vietnam had replaced one of China's key regional partners with a government they saw as a threat. This intervention was seen by China not as a righteous liberation, but as an expansion of Vietnam's influence. Worse, China feared that Vietnam was being backed by the Soviet Union, and this growing alliance made China uneasy. China had always prided itself on its dominance in Southeast Asia, and Vietnam's power was rising in a way that Beijing could no longer ignore. Vietnam's actions signaled that it was no longer content with being a small, isolated nation. It was asserting itself on the regional stage, and that threatened China. The fear was simple. A stronger Vietnam, with Soviet support, could shift the balance of power in the region, leaving China sidelined. And for a rising superpower, that was unacceptable. As Vietnam's influence grew, China decided it could no longer wait. Deng Xiaoping, China's leader at the time, saw the rise of Vietnam as a direct challenge to China's interests. He believed that Vietnam had to be put in its place. The idea was to teach Vietnam a lesson, make sure that they knew their place in the region, and remind them of who the true power in Southeast Asia was. In 1979, China acted. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops were mobilized, and they crossed the border into Vietnam. The goal was clear: assert dominance, push back against the growing influence of Vietnam, and neutralize what China saw as a growing threat to its regional position. China wasn't looking for a long, drawn-out war. The plan was for a quick, decisive strike that would reassert Chinese power and show Vietnam that it could not challenge China without consequences. China's objective was not just military success, but political dominance. The hope was that by invading Vietnam, China could regain control over the regional power dynamics, making it clear that no nation in Southeast Asia could outgrow China's shadow without repercussions. The stakes were high, and China believed that this was the only way to stop Vietnam from becoming too powerful. When China crossed into Vietnam in 1979, they didn't face a weak, unprepared enemy. Vietnam had been engaged in nearly constant warfare for decades, and its soldiers were no strangers to hardship. The Vietnamese had fought off the French during the First Indochina War and then defeated the United States in the Vietnam War, two of the most powerful militaries in the world. These experiences had forged a battle-hardened army, one that knew how to fight in harsh conditions and was willing to make great sacrifices to protect their land. The Vietnamese people had a deep sense of nationalism and were fiercely protective of their sovereignty. Their determination to defend their country was unshakable. After enduring years of foreign invasions, they were not about to let another power, especially China, take control of their land. This spirit would be a significant challenge for the Chinese forces. On the other hand, China's military, once seen as an unstoppable force, quickly found itself in a fight unlike any it had anticipated. The Chinese army was large and well-equipped, but it underestimated the resilience of the Vietnamese. They expected a quick victory, assuming that the Vietnamese would surrender easily given the massive disparity in troop numbers. However, the battle turned into a bloody quagmire. The Vietnamese, familiar with their terrain and highly motivated to defend their homeland, fought back fiercely. The Chinese forces were caught off guard by the intensity of the resistance. What was supposed to be a swift, decisive strike quickly turned into a prolonged and bloody struggle. China's troops found themselves bogged down in difficult terrain, facing ambushes and skirmishes that slowed their advance. The expected victory became elusive, and casualties mounted on both sides. As the days passed, it became clear that China had underestimated its enemy. The Vietnamese were not just defending their land, they were fighting to survive, and they made sure the Chinese felt the full weight of their resolve. Despite their numerical advantage, China struggled to make significant progress, and what was supposed to be a quick operation stretched into a costly, protracted war. After months of intense fighting, the Chinese army, once confident in its strength, found itself trapped in a humiliating retreat. What had started as a swift military operation to teach Vietnam a lesson had turned into a painful lesson for China itself. Despite sending hundreds of thousands of troops, China's forces were unable to achieve their objectives. The battle-hardened Vietnamese troops, fiercely protective of their land, had inflicted significant losses on the Chinese. The Chinese strategy of overwhelming force didn't account for the resilience and tactical advantage Vietnam held. What was supposed to be a quick victory for China became a protracted and bloody struggle, costing both sides heavy casualties. The goal of crushing Vietnam's spirit and establishing China's dominance in Southeast Asia quickly became a distant dream. Instead, the Chinese army found itself bogged down, unable to advance as they had planned. In the end, China's retreat was a clear admission of failure. The invasion, meant to reassert China's power and send a warning to Vietnam, ended up backfiring. Instead of weakening Vietnam, the invasion had emboldened it. The humiliating withdrawal marked the campaign as a defeat for China, and the world watched as a once-feared military giant retreated in shame. In conclusion, why did China invade? The invasion wasn't just about Vietnam's intervention in Cambodia. It was about power, fear, and regional influence. China saw Vietnam's growing strength as a direct challenge to its authority in Southeast Asia. The rising influence of a Soviet-backed Vietnam, coupled with its successful intervention in Cambodia, threatened China's position in the region. What China perceived as a move to protect its interests ultimately became an overreaction that spiraled out of control. The 1979 invasion of Vietnam became a significant turning point in China-Vietnam relations. It reshaped how both countries viewed one another and left a lasting impact on Southeast Asia's geopolitical landscape. The invasion serves as a stark reminder that even the most powerful nations can miscalculate when pride and power are at stake. In international relations, the consequences of misjudgment can be far-reaching, and no matter how strong a nation may seem, there's always a price to pay for underestimating its opponents.